She was paid to spy on a queen, then watched her die with tears in her eyes. For 19 days, Margaret Dymoke slept at the foot of Anne Boleyn's bed, recording every word for the man who would kill her. Today's video is about the woman who was supposed to hate her and ended up believing she was innocent. But why did she stay silent for 40 years? In this video, we'll uncover the true story of Margaret Dymoke. Thomas Cromwell handpicked her to watch Anne Boleyn's every move in the Tower of London, to find evidence that would justify Anne's execution. What did she hear in those tower rooms that would haunt her for 40 years? And why did this trusted spy, handpicked to destroy Anne, end up weeping at her execution? The answer lies in 19 days of secret reports that still exist today, and they tell a very different story than the one Henry VIII wanted the world to believe. Hit that subscribe button to help us uncover more hidden stories from the Tower of London. To understand Margaret Dymoke's silence on Anne Boleyn's innocence, we have to understand her background and why Margaret Dymoke seemed like the perfect choice for Cromwell's plan. She wasn't some random court lady. She was married to Sir William Coffin, Anne Boleyn's own master of the horse. She'd been around the royal court for years. She knew how to keep secrets, how to blend in, how to watch without being noticed. Most importantly, she had legitimate reasons to be near Anne. Nobody would question why the master of the horse's wife was helping tend to the queen in her final days. Cromwell's instructions were simple. Sleep in Anne's room. Listen to everything. Report back anything useful. He needed someone trustworthy, someone loyal, someone who wouldn't let emotions get in the way. He thought he'd found that person in Margaret. The Dymoke family had served English kings for generations. They were the hereditary champions of England, literally the family who would fight duels to defend the king's honor. Loyalty was in Margaret's blood. When Cromwell approached her in early May 1536, she probably felt honored to serve. Anne Boleyn was accused of sleeping with 5 different men, including her own brother. If the queen really was guilty of such horrible crimes, then someone needed to make sure justice was done. Margaret entered the Tower of London thinking she was about to watch a guilty woman get what she deserved. What she found was completely different. Anne wasn't the cold, calculating adulteress that Cromwell had described. She was a mess. One minute laughing hysterically, the next minute sobbing. She kept asking the same questions over and over. What have I done? Why won't anyone tell me what I've done wrong? Margaret's sleeping arrangement put her right in the middle of Anne's most private moments. While Lady Kingston slept outside the door, Margaret shared Anne's actual bedroom. She and Lady Boleyn, Anne's aunt, took turns on a small bed at the foot of the Queen's bed. This meant Margaret heard everything: Anne talking in her sleep, Anne praying, Anne crying out Henry's name, not in passion, but in confusion and pain. And what Margaret heard didn't sound like guilt. It sounded like genuine bewilderment. This was the same woman Margaret had seen at court functions back when Anne was still queen. She remembered Anne's intelligence, her devotion to reforming the church, and how much she clearly loved her daughter Elizabeth. Now Margaret was watching that same person fall apart, desperately trying to understand charges that seemed to make no sense to her. But Margaret's real education was just beginning. Over the next 19 days, she would see something that would change how she understood truth, loyalty, and the price of speaking up. Every single day, Margaret wrote detailed reports to Sir William Kingston, the Tower's constable. These reports still survive in the National Archives, and they tell us exactly what she witnessed behind those locked doors. Anne's behavior wasn't what anyone would expect from a guilty woman trying to cover her tracks. She talked about Henry constantly, but not with the bitter hatred of a betrayed wife or the calculating coldness of a caught adulteress. Instead, she spoke with genuine, heartbroken confusion. "How can he believe this about me?" she would ask Margaret directly, as if Margaret might have some answer. "Doesn't he know me at all? After everything we've been through together, how can he think I would do such things?" Anne asked incredibly specific questions about the charges against her, questions that someone guilty would already know the answers to. When told that Mark Smeaton, her young musician, had confessed under torture to sleeping with her, Anne seemed genuinely shocked. "Mark said what? But that's completely impossible. When would this have happened? I'm never alone with any man except Henry. There are always ladies present, always guards nearby. How could anyone believe such a thing?" But the most disturbing thing Margaret witnessed was during the long, dark hours of the night. Anne talked in her sleep, constantly. She would cry out Henry's name, but not in passion or longing, in pure distress and confusion. She would mumble fragmented prayers, asking God to help her for sins she didn't understand and couldn't name. Sometimes she would wake up suddenly, heart racing, and grab Margaret's arm. "Did I say anything important while I was sleeping? Did I say something that could be used against me?" Think about that for a moment. This wasn't someone trying to hide guilt from the world. This was someone so terrified that she might accidentally confess to crimes she hadn't committed, that she was afraid of her own unconscious mind. Then came the moment that really got under Margaret's skin. One afternoon, Anne asked about Margaret's husband, William Coffin. Her face lit up when she mentioned his name. She asked if he was well, if his horses were being properly cared for, if he was managing all right with the chaos at court. She spoke about William like he was a dear friend, someone she trusted completely, someone whose welfare genuinely mattered to her. Margaret realized, with a sick feeling in her stomach, that Anne had absolutely no idea that her beloved master of the horse had helped orchestrate her downfall. The woman asking so tenderly about William's health didn't know that William had worked with Cromwell to put her in this stone prison. She didn't know that William's own wife was now recording her every word for the men planning to kill her. But Margaret's real crisis of conscience started during Anne's religious observances. Anne requested Mass multiple times during her imprisonment, and as her attendant, Margaret was required to witness these intensely private moments of devotion. What she saw during those prayers changed everything she thought she knew about guilt and innocence. Anne didn't pray like someone seeking forgiveness for adultery and treason. She didn't beg God's pardon for betraying her marriage vows or plotting against the crown. Instead, she prayed like someone desperately trying to understand God's mysterious plan for her life. Her prayers were confused and questioning, not confessional. She would ask God to help Henry see the truth about her character, not to forgive her for sins she'd committed. The absolute breaking point came when Anne took communion. In the 16th century, taking Holy Communion while lying about mortal sins wasn't just morally wrong. People genuinely believed it would damn your soul to hell for all eternity. Nobody facing imminent death would risk their eternal salvation by lying during the most sacred moment of Christian worship. Yet Anne took the sacrament with complete solemnity and peace, swearing her innocence before God with her execution just days away. Margaret watched this sacred moment and realized she was witnessing something historically enormous. An innocent woman was being systematically destroyed by the Tudor political machine, and she was being forced to help document the process. Her reports to Kingston began to change subtly. She was still dutifully following Cromwell's orders, but she started focusing on different aspects of Anne's behavior. Instead of recording potentially damaging statements that could be twisted into evidence of guilt, she began emphasizing Anne's religious devotion, her constant worry for her daughter Elizabeth, her genuine bewilderment about the charges against her. Without quite realizing it, Margaret was creating a historical record that completely contradicted everything Cromwell wanted to prove.
May 15th, 1536. Anne's trial was over. The verdict was guilty on all charges. Nobody in the courtroom was surprised by the outcome, except possibly Anne herself, who seemed stunned by the swiftness and certainty of her condemnation. Margaret walked with Anne back to her tower chambers, where she would spend her final 4 days on earth preparing for an executioner's sword. This is when Margaret witnessed the most profound and unsettling transformation she'd ever seen in another human being. Anne completely stopped asking, "Why is this happening to me?" Instead, she began preparing to die with the kind of serene determination that Margaret had only heard about in stories of Christian martyrs facing Roman lions. She requested her confessor multiple times each day. She took communion repeatedly. She spent long hours in private prayer, sometimes kneeling so long that Margaret worried about her knees against the stone floor. But there was something different about Anne's demeanor now, a kind of calm, spiritual focus that seemed almost otherworldly. Anne also started talking more openly about her marriage to Henry, but not with the bitterness or resentment anyone would expect from a wife facing execution. Instead, she spoke with deep sadness for what their love had become. She told Margaret intimate stories about the early days of their courtship, when Henry had pursued her relentlessly for years, writing her love letters, composing songs for her, promising to reform the entire English church just to marry her. "I truly believed God intended our marriage to bring reform to England," Anne confided. "I thought our love was part of his plan for the country." She talked about her miscarriages not as personal failures, but as heartbreaks that had somehow been twisted by her enemies into evidence of God's disapproval of their union. "Every child I lost felt like losing a piece of my soul," she whispered to Margaret. But Henry's advisors convinced him that my inability to bear a living son meant our marriage was cursed. Most remarkably, Anne began expressing genuine forgiveness toward the men who had testified against her. She seemed to understand, with startling clarity, that they had been coerced or terrified into giving false testimony. Margaret recorded Anne saying she bore no ill will toward those who had been compelled to speak against their own consciences to save their own lives. But Margaret's ultimate test of conscience came on the morning of May 18th, Anne's final day of life. Anne made her last confession before taking communion for the final time, and she did something that left Margaret completely shaken. Standing before her confessor, with Margaret, Lady Kingston, and Lady Boleyn as witnesses, Anne swore on the Holy Sacrament that she had never committed adultery with any man, never conspired against the king, and never given Henry legitimate cause for the accusations against her. She said these words not just to her priest, but in front of the very women who had been documenting her every statement for 19 days. Margaret later told Kingston that this moment was the most solemn and sacred thing she had ever witnessed in her life. Anne wasn't performing for an audience or making some desperate last-minute plea for mercy. She was speaking directly to God in her final hours, with absolute knowledge that lies told during communion would damn her soul for eternity. No guilty person, no matter how desperate, would risk eternal damnation just to maintain earthly deceptions. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep at all. She lay on her uncomfortable pallet bed, listening to Anne pray quietly through the long, dark hours. Anne wasn't praying for some miraculous escape or last-minute royal pardon. She was praying for the spiritual strength to die well and for God to watch over her 3-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, after she was gone. When dawn broke on May 19th, Margaret helped Anne dress for her execution with trembling hands. Anne was strangely, eerily calm. She chose her clothes with care, selected jewelry that would be appropriate for her final public appearance, and asked Margaret to help arrange her hair so that the executioner's job would be as easy as possible. Think about that remarkable detail. Even facing her own death, Anne Boleyn was trying to make things more convenient for the man who was about to kill her. This small act of consideration, making her own execution easier for her executioner, convinced Margaret absolutely and finally of Anne's essential goodness and innocence.
May 19th, 1536. Margaret Dymoke walked behind Anne Boleyn toward the scaffold, knowing with absolute certainty that she was about to witness the judicial murder of an innocent woman. What happened next is documented in multiple eyewitness accounts that still survive today. Anne delivered her carefully composed final speech, following the strict royal protocol that required condemned queens to avoid directly contradicting the king's judgment. She knelt gracefully, removed her pearl-studded headdress, and allowed one of her ladies to tie a blindfold around her eyes. But the contemporary accounts also record something else that most history books leave out. Anne's 4 ladies-in-waiting were described as being in great distress, bereft of their souls, and weeping openly. Margaret was one of those crying women. The spy who had been sent to find evidence of Anne's guilt was instead watching an innocent woman die with more dignity and grace than any of her accusers could have managed. When the French executioner's sword fell with one clean stroke, Margaret and the other 3 ladies immediately rushed forward to Anne's body. They wrapped both her head and body in clean white cloth and carried them themselves to the Tower Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. No men helped them with this grim task. No elaborate funeral preparations had been made by the crown. These 4 women, who had spent 19 days serving as Anne's jailers and surveillance team, became her only mourners and the only people who treated her remains with dignity. Margaret's transformation was now complete. She had entered the Tower as Thomas Cromwell's carefully chosen agent and was leaving as Anne Boleyn's witness to history. But Margaret's ordeal still wasn't over. In the days immediately following the execution, Margaret was required to file comprehensive final reports to both Kingston and Cromwell about Anne's last words, final behaviors, and dying statements. These reports still exist in the historical archives, and they reveal Margaret's subtle but unmistakable rebellion against her original mission. Instead of emphasizing anything that could be used to posthumously justify Anne's execution, Margaret's final reports focused entirely on Anne's profound religious devotion, her constant maternal concern for Elizabeth's future, and her unwavering protestations of innocence right up until her final breath. Margaret was deliberately creating a historical record that told the truth instead of supporting the Crown's official narrative. Margaret Dymoke returned to her life as Sir William Coffin's wife, but she carried the crushing weight of those 19 days for the remaining 40 years of her life.
Here's what most people don't understand about Margaret's long silence. She had absolutely no choice but to keep quiet about what she'd witnessed. In Tudor England, publicly questioning the king's justice wasn't just disloyal, it was literal treason, punishable by death. Thomas Cromwell, the master manipulator who had orchestrated Anne's entire downfall, remained Henry's most trusted advisor for 4 more years. One careless word defending Anne's innocence could have destroyed Margaret and her entire family. Margaret's silence wasn't cowardice, it was survival. In Henry's England, one wrong word could cost you your head. But here's the remarkable thing. Margaret didn't let the real truth disappear entirely. Her meticulously detailed reports to Kingston, carefully preserved in the Tower's official records, provide historians today with some of our most intimate and revealing glimpses into Anne Boleyn's final days. Unlike the propaganda and political spin that dominated public accounts of Anne's downfall, Margaret's private reports show Anne exactly as she really was: complex, frightened, confused, but ultimately dignified in facing the most unjust death imaginable. Modern historians who've studied Margaret's reports have noticed how they systematically undermine every major element of the case against Anne Boleyn. Whether Margaret consciously intended this effect or simply couldn't help recording what she actually observed, she created a historical record that supports Anne's innocence, the exact opposite of what Cromwell had sent her to accomplish. Margaret's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, loyalty, and the personal cost of speaking truth to absolute power. She was ordered to document guilt, but discovered innocence instead. She was supposed to spy on an enemy of the state, but ended up mourning an innocent victim of political manipulation. Her transformation from Cromwell's trusted spy to Anne's secret defender demonstrates how proximity to truth can fundamentally change even those who begin as committed enemies. Margaret's tears at that Tower Green scaffold were her only possible public rebellion against the injustice she was witnessing. But her secret reports, carefully preserved in official ink and parchment, became her lasting voice. A voice strong enough to echo across 5 centuries and help modern historians understand what really happened to Anne Boleyn. Sometimes history's most crucial witnesses are exactly the people who had to whisper in their own dangerous times, but managed to leave behind words powerful enough for us to hear clearly today. Margaret Dymoke's reports are still being studied by Tudor historians around the world. What do you think about her impossible situation, forced to choose between following orders and following her conscience? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more hidden stories from Tudor England that deserve to be told.